Hello, folks, and welcome to another episode of the Dr. Mark Foster Show. This particular program will be more sociological in nature. Wanted to begin by talking about Immanuel Wallerstein, a sociology professor, an American sociology professor, and the founder of what he refers to as world systems analysis. He is a Marxist sociologist, influenced to some extent by some of the different developmental perspectives in sociology. And what Wallerstein has said is that he anticipates that what he refers to as the capitalist world system is in the middle of a collapse. Now, he is not the only person to make that kind of observation, but I think the way he explains it is very good, primarily because of the way in which he defines the capitalist world system. Classically, most Marxists have understood capitalism as being an economic system. While Wallerstein certainly does not deny that capitalism has an economic component, he has expanded upon capitalism to include other aspects as well: sociological, political, artistic, cultural, and so forth. In other words, to Wallerstein, capitalism is a complex. It is not simply something which can be reduced to the economic relations between the capitalists and the workers, even though that may be an important beginning. Similarly, Kimberly Crenshaw developed a perspective which she referred to as intersectionality. It was later adopted by sociologist Patricia Hill Collins. Intersectionality is also a Marxist perspective, but somewhat different. The metaphor that Kimberly Crenshaw has given for intersectionality is a map. If you think of a map with all of the roads that exist on it, all the intersections which exist on the map, then you have a lot of different possibilities. For example, where I live, there is a street, which I try to avoid as much as possible, called Rutherford, which has two roundabouts, or as we call them in New York City, traffic circles, where people come from multiple directions and have to yield to traffic coming from another place. Now, predictably, because there are not that many traffic circles in this part of the country, unlike in Boston, Massachusetts, for example, people make mistakes a lot of times. And so I am always cautious whenever I have to go down Rutherford, because I assume that the person that I am encountering in that traffic circle will make a mistake. So even if I have the right of way, I will pause and am willing to give the right of way to the other driver. Now, say you have a four-way stop. That's a bit different. Most people are used to four-way stops. You know that when you stop at the stop sign, that whoever stopped at the stop sign first has the right of way. Traffic circles are a bit more confusing. So the more intersections that you have, the more confusing things become. When we look at the issue of capitalism, capitalism can be defined, as it has been by Crenshaw, as intersectionality. In other words, it is not a simple issue of the oppressors and the oppressed, or the capitalists and the workers. There are multiple different intersections which need to be considered. For example, say you have a woman, she happens to be a white or European American woman who works for a company, and she is being sexually harassed by her male boss. She files a grievance against him, justifiably and understandably. Then she comes home. Her husband makes a lot more money than she does, and she lives in a relatively affluent neighborhood. They find out that there are plans to build a minority housing development or tenement a few blocks away from where she lives. Well, as is the case with many people, the first statement that she makes is, "Oh no, it will lower the property values." Well, that may be a possible thought in the back of people's minds, but generally that is simply an excuse for a kind of implicit bias or implicit institutional racism which exists in American society. And so perhaps she gets together with her husband and joins with other families, and they approach the zoning commission and try to pressure the zoning commission not to allow this tenement to be constructed in their neighborhood. Okay, well, in the first instance, this woman on her job was in the status of someone who was being oppressed. In the second instance, she was in the status of someone who is the oppressor. That's the way oppression works. And so throughout our lives, we are not simply oppressors and oppressed people. It depends upon the particular intersection that we are looking at. Whether that intersection is a racial intersection, a gender intersection, a class intersection, a national intersection, a religious intersection, and so on. And that is what determines the way in which oppression works. If you take those two approaches, world systems analysis, developed by Wallerstein, and intersectionality, developed by Crenshaw and Collins, I think you have a really good perspective on oppression or capitalism. Now, back in the 20th century, and my parents lived through this. My parents both lived through the Depression. My father's family was a wealthy family. They lost all of their wealth during the Depression. My mother's family was always poor. Her father, who died before I was born, was never a success at anything he tried. And so both families really suffered a great deal during the Depression. My mother had plans of becoming a medical doctor. She had to set those aside and get a job to help support her family. My father had plans of becoming a heating and air conditioning person, or perhaps training for some other field. Because of the Depression and because of various circumstances after he came back from World War II, he had to set those aside, and he ended up becoming an optician. He went to optical school in New York City. So the situation changed considerably. So my parents were working class parents. My father an optician, my mother a teacher's aide. I am a college professor, the director of an institute at the college, and my sister is a corporate vice president. So you can never really know exactly what will happen from one generation to the next. However, my family is actually an exception. The best predictor of what social class a person will occupy is the social class of their own parents. Usually, if parents are working class, the children will be working class. If parents are middle class, so will the children. If parents are wealthy, the children will be wealthy, and so on. That is true in the vast majority of cases. If you look at the current coronavirus, the way it is disproportionately affecting black and brown communities, people with high degrees of hypertension and diabetes, and overall lack of access to quality medical care because of disproportionate poverty. The rate of coronavirus has been substantially higher than it has been among the European American population. So all of the hopes that people like me had during the civil rights movement of the 1960s that we would tackle, or perhaps naively we thought we had tackled, the issue of racism came to naught. In other words, things like the continued assassinations of young African American women and men by police officers has continued. Back in the early 1970s, I spent a summer in South Carolina. I used to go to South Carolina on a fairly regular basis related to my religion. I knew this guy named Jack, who was a member of my religion. Got to know him and his wife, Hattie. I would go over to their home. I would sit on their porch and have these long conversations with Jack. I thought that Jack was quite old. In retrospect, he was probably about 20 years younger than I am now. One day, I went over to see him. I noticed that there was a wreath hanging on their door. I knocked on the door. Hattie opened the door, and I said something unintentionally horrendous. This was in August. I said, Hattie, it's a bit early to be celebrating Christmas, isn't it? Still get like choking when I say that. Hattie said to me, Mark, Jack got shot today. I said, Hattie, I'm deeply sorry. I'm deeply sorry. And I left. I never saw Hattie again after that. I went by to see her a couple of weeks later and she was gone. Her house was abandoned. I can understand that. Here's what happened. Jack was a very open person. In that time, that was dangerous for an African American to be open, to be blunt, to speak his or her mind. That's precisely what Jack did all the time, which is why I liked him so much. Jack was a basketball fan. He got to the basketball game at a high school early, got a seat in the front bleachers. A sheriff's deputy that knew him, everybody knew Jack, walked up to him and said, Jack, I want your seat. And Jack said, "No, it's my seat. I got here first." The deputy sheriff repeated, "Jack, I want your seat." This was as it was reported in the local paper. And again, Jack said, "No, it's my seat." At that point, the deputy sheriff pulled out his revolver and shot Jack point blank in the head, and Jack was dead. Following protocol, the deputy sheriff was arrested, spent the night in jail. The district attorney pressed no charges. He was released the following morning and was back on the force. That is still, to this day, in 2020, the case. It is extraordinarily rare for police officers, especially white police officers, but not exclusively white, to be convicted when they kill innocent black women and men. At that time, I was not aware how widespread that problem was. I thought it was a relatively unique situation. Later, of course, we all found out with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, which started as a Twitter hashtag with 3 black women whose wives were unjustly killed by the police, how widespread that problem was. So what was the response of many, certainly not all, police officers to Black Lives Matter? They started a new campaign, Blue Lives Matter. There was a Black Lives Matter wristband, and I actually have one. They came out with a Blue Lives Matter wristband, and many police officers began wearing it. And now, certainly, everybody's life matters. That's certainly true. But if I say, or more appropriately, if somebody who is African American were to say, Black Lives Matter, and the response that is given to me is all lives matter, that shows that the person has totally missed the point. Because historically, in the United States, black lives have simply not mattered. They've simply not mattered. It goes back to the days of slavery, the days of lynchings, of blazing crosses on African Americans' lawns. That's all a part of the really horrendous legacy of racism in American history. So the idea of the oppression of African Americans is certainly an important consideration which forms a part of intersectionality and the capitalist world system. The issue of the oppression of women, the issue of the harassment of women, where many women have been speaking up now and talking about their own experiences, in many cases for the first time. The person who is always the most challenged in that is always the first person. Those who come after generally have an easier time of it, especially with regard to a single incident. But it's very, very difficult when you have been harassed, worse when you've been raped. The easiest thing to do for many people is to try to forget it. Because each time you talk about it, it's like you're reliving it. And most people don't want to do that. And it's only been within the last few decades that most police departments have had dedicated police officers who were trained to deal with matters of sexual assault. Very, very recent. All the people who were allegedly raped by the comedian, so-called comedian Bill Cosby, who did not speak out about it, who were intimidated by Bill Cosby's power, and who felt that if they spoke out, it would ruin their careers. Really horrendous. That is a separate intersection. So all of those things, I think, can be looked at as a part of this, what I call the intersectional capitalist world system. So where is that intersectional capitalist world system right now in 2020? I think in 2020, we are in a similar position to my parents in 1929, the year of the great stock market crash, which initiated the Great Depression. Now, many people have said, well, the economy now, earlier this year, last year, was doing well. The only reason why the economy is suddenly in trouble, why we have all these people filing for unemployment, is because of COVID-19. That is not exactly true. The economy has been held together like a patchwork quilt. For years, it has been propped up by the International Monetary Fund, in this country by the Federal Reserve and similar bodies in other countries, or else it would have collapsed a long time ago. In other words, the capitalist world system was in tatters for many, many, many years before this. What COVID-19 has done, I think, it has simply revealed the problems that existed in the capitalist world system all this time. So it seems to me that the intersectional capitalist world system, with its legacy of the oppression of workers, the oppression of women, the oppression of black and brown people, the oppression of the poor, and so on, is on the verge of a complete collapse. Only time will tell what happens in the months ahead. That concludes this episode of the Dr. Mark Foster Show. Have a good one.